Back in the spring of 2018, I was camping with my friends at a lake in the Adirondack Mountains. Me and two buddies took sleeping bags out towards the deep woods, looking for a good place to sleep. We wanted to be far enough away from other campers, but not so far that we would have to walk all night long in order to get back before breakfast. It was getting late, and we weren't exactly sure where we were going, so we stopped and decided to pitch our tent by an old tree stump. I thought that I saw a silhouette of something staring at me through the darkness, but when I looked again, it was gone. There are no bears or wolves out here, according to my prior knowledge, so I couldn't think of what else it could have been, staring at us like what I saw. The wind shifted, bringing with it a wave of the most awful stench I've ever tasted. I used to spend a lot of my time helping my uncle on his ranch, where awful smells were a part of his daily routine. So it wasn't like I was really a soft city boy that had never gotten a whiff of any of the foulness that nature can truly serve. And that was just as there was something unnatural about the odor. Not just in its potency, but okay, it smelled evil. I couldn't spell it out for you what evil smells like, but I just knew in that moment. The smell lasted less for than half a breath, and then, like the creature I'd seen, it was gone. I tried to tell my buddies that I thought there was something out there with us. Not only were they not impressed, they were irritated, thinking that I was trying to scare them. I got irritated just the same. We had words and we spent a stretch of time not speaking to each other, just setting up our sleeping gear. I got barked at several times for not being much help getting things ready. I kept gazing all around us. I was on high alert, and I didn't know how to turn it off. I couldn't bring my eyes down to my hands to perform menial tasks. My buddies told me to drop the childish game, that I was never going to really scare them. Words, at least convincing words, failed me. We all went to bed mad at each other. The anger distracted me for a short while, just long enough that when I heard sounds outside the tent, I was surprised. I held my breath for so long that it's a wonder I didn't pass out. It was as if I knew, down on a cellular level, that if I allowed one more breath in or out, we were dead. I listened to the footsteps outside. They didn't seem concerned with masking their presence. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched, and most troubling of all, I heard snorts. Have you ever heard a dog snort so hard that it almost sounds like a bark? That's pretty close to what I was hearing. And my friends were either sleeping through it, or they were frozen solid, as I was. Just as I thought the thing out there was going to leave, I'd hear it come back again. It slowly dawned on me that it was circling us, slowly and deliberately. I wondered if it was pacing. Then it hit me. What if the guys were trying to scare me? Desperation drove me to consider how far either of them would go to get somebody to trail us while we were camping, and make an all-night affair of sucking me out. My fear was slowly turning into anger, just enough to allow me to breathe and reach for the zipper of the tent. I was going to find out what was really going on. My heartbeat knocked me back down as the zipper opened, blasted me with the stench of evil from before. It was the briefest perception, but it shook me, made me pause and ask myself if I was really up to finding out what was making the noises and the stink. I pushed my way outside the tent with my ribs rattling from my own heartbeat. There was a full moon with patches of clouds that winked. That awful evil smell came to me in snatches as the breeze stirred, and couldn't exactly make up its mind which direction it was going to blow from. Did I really step outside my tent without my flashlight? I did, and I didn't want to fetch it for fear I'd have knives or claws in my back the instant I turned. I looked in the general direction that I thought I heard the last few footfalls. I saw nothing. But I swear that just as I had smelled evil, I could feel something looking at me. The moon unveiled briefly. It struggled to trace the outline of something standing about 30 paces away from me. The thing was so dark that it was nearly invisible, save for the glint of moonlight finding its edges. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in the devil, demons, angels, or anything else. But the thing that the moon was trying to show me was enough to turn me religious for just a moment. 4 curved horns jutted from this thing's head. The head was goatish, but not without human features. It had 2 long ears and twitching. It was when it bared its teeth that I thought I saw one of its earlobes had something hanging. It could have just been a bit of matted fur, but it got to me for the moment. There I was, facing something that was not only anything unlike I'd ever seen, but there were those little details that it could have been intelligent. My brain transformed the bared teeth into a smile. It was indeed taunting me. I couldn't handle it any longer. I yelled. I wanted to yell words, but amorphous howls were all I could manage. The raw evil radiating from the thing reduced me to basic instincts. It ran away on 2 legs, a strong bounce in its gait, but the backbone of the thing moved its torso with serpentine reptilian movement. My friends found me screaming. They also found that I had messed myself. They wanted to laugh, but the implications held them back. They knew that I wouldn't have gone that far just to prop up a prank. Our relationship shortly thinned after that. The creature may have not done us any bodily harm, but something about it lingered that tainted our friendship. Our unbreakable bond became cracked and was never the same again after we encountered what I believe was the Goat Man. Me and my 2 best friends were out for a camping trip, out in the deep woods. We'd been going to the same place now since we were very young, and it's not exactly new ground. So me, age 26, Ben, 27, and Chris, 29, all of us are close to 30 now, decided to make this our one last trip before we all let our childhood innocence go. You know, I kind of regret that decision, but I guess none of us thought we'd ever have a good memory to replace it with after this happened. Keep in mind, here these guys are my best friends, and brothers in all but blood, but if something happened to them, I'd protect them with everything I am. I guess you could say that I found out everything I'm not. Much of our camping was a little ritual of remarking at how small everything had gotten since we were kids. The towering cliff was just now a large rock. That dramatic waterfall was now just a sharp slope where the creek ran down. All of these were things we remarked at every single time we camped there. It was like a museum of relics from a time gone by, and we cherished each one. There was only one thing that we weren't so fond of. There was a hole in the hillside that was big enough to be a rabbit's warren when we were kids. It was the one thing that seemed to have gotten bigger as we got bigger. Wow, that's still there, is the most any of us would ever say about it. Most of the time, we pretended it wasn't there. Chris was the one that questioned our apprehension out loud. He asked us why we never really would look at it, or what was down in the old hole. Only after ever hearing him raise the matter did it seem so childish and ridiculous, being so intimidated by a simple hole in the earth. Each of us tried to articulate what it was that had kept us spellbound with fear over it. None of us could manage my explanation that made sense. I said that it just didn't feel right to look at it too long. I couldn't explain why I felt that way. Chris proposed that we camp within eye shot of the hole, just so we could say that we overcame our fear. Looking back, I think I could tell that he really didn't like the sound of his own idea. as if there was something about that hole that bothered him so much that he wasn't going to be at peace until he found a way to lay it to rest. And he was dressing that childhood fear up as some personal hurdle we could conquer together. None of us liked the idea, but we did it anyway, so we could be rid of the phantom fear. Night came, and there was a halo of silence and stillness that surrounded the hole and the area around it. Maybe I would have felt better if I had heard something moving around in there. But that absolute emptiness, stillness, that unknown that escaped us from childhood, was somehow more frightening than anything else. When there finally was a sound in the quiet, it wasn't coming from the hole. It was coming from Ben. I thought he was trying to creep me out. He stood outside the tent and started whistling some creepy little tune. It didn't help that we couldn't whistle very well. Then he was chuckling. I wanted to tell him that he was planning on doing something, that he was already giving himself away. But his footsteps and his whistling and chuckling faded. I can't even tell you why I bolted out of the tent in that moment, but I did. Somehow, I just knew. And the LED of my phone, I saw his scrambling into the hole as the best he could fit. I grabbed him one ankle and pulled him out. The look on his face is something I will see for the rest of my days. He didn't look horrified like he had seen a ghost or anything like that. He was smiling so hard that I thought his head would split in half. His eyes were wide open, like his eyelids had been cut off. He couldn't live on his own anymore after that. He was placed in a mental health facility, where he would spend most of his time sitting down with that strained grin on his face. He wouldn't blink. Nurses even had to artificially moisten his eyes. And out of nowhere, he would have terrible fits. Nurses would be forced to restrain him. Of course, there was a rational explanation for all of it. He was that 1 in a million cases of young dementia. They were baffled as to how it became so pronounced, without any warning signs. They certainly weren't going to buy into our story. Well, we didn't really have a story. We camped out near a hole we were all afraid of as we grew up. What did it do? Suck his soul out or something? I don't know. We never really sat down and analyzed it. But me and Chris knew that our campsite had more to do with Ben's condition than the doctor's test would ever reveal. We never went near that place ever again, and I have no idea what the hell is in that hole. Only being a rookie on the search and rescue, I was deeply disturbed by my findings. I was assigned to the crime scene, where I had found a dismembered body, abandoned by the side of the road. Nevertheless, I was grateful for any experiences that would help me grow as a wildlife officer, and I knew that this experience would provide excellent training opportunities. The victim's head and limbs were all scattered across several yards from each other. Due to this fact, we were able to determine the animal responsible very easily. Our clues came in our general surroundings. Pieces of clothing or belongings are usually left behind after an attack, due to fear of being identified, as in cases with humans as well. The one huge drawback to this was the further we investigated, it didn't match any known killing of any local wildlife we knew. Usually, we were able to identify teeth and bite marks, scratches and claw marks. There might be fur of an actual animal here that we tested, but not making any sense. Nothing came up as a match in our vast systems. No one could identify the clump of orange-looking matted fur that was left by the victim's head. Worst of the matter, it almost looked as if the head and limbs had been ripped from the body. Not mauled or torn with teeth or claws. Ripped, using brute strength. Now you tell me, what the hell kind of animal would be able to do that? Once the police and medical examiner came, removing the body and any evidence, we were able to further explore the area. Since I was only a rookie, I had to tag along with one of the older guys, and to be honest, I was okay with that. I wasn't sure I was going to get the sight of that body out of my mind for a long time. The boss told him we had to check the area. Until that point, I didn't even know we split the area by letters, and before I could even glean any more information, we were off. I noticed my buddy had made sure the rifle was loaded and ready before we ever headed off. We drove around for a bit, taking the truck through the woods and hiking trail until we got to a far denser part of the parkland that I had never been to before. The ranger just sat there with the engine idling for a bit, looking into the trees in front of us, which were way too close together to drive through. It was weird, but I would have sworn there was something like fear in his eyes. "This is as far as I go," he told me. "Not only because the truck can't get through, but we don't belong out there." Of course, I had to ask what he meant by that. So I asked him, "What do you mean don't belong? Rangers can't go. Is it private land?" He looked at me and replied real seriously that people can't go in there, and it wasn't just exclusive to rangers. I wanted to ask more, but his silence seemed to imply that that was the end of the conversation, at least for now. And although it seemed to be a real odd thing to say, I didn't think too much of it. Not right then, anyway. We drove back to the ranger station, having scouted the area and not seen anything else suspicious, or indeed anything else at all. There didn't seem to be a deer, rabbit, or even a bird in sight. There was a strange atmosphere back at the station too. Even though I was still quite new, they'd always treated me as a part of the team, keen and eager to take me under their wing, to help me learn the ropes. I'd been told many stories, and most of them had humorous anecdotes about various findings and when they'd done something silly, which they could laugh about after. But this was different. They didn't seem to want to include me. There were lots of looks passed between them, as if there was something they all knew except me, and I couldn't work out what was going on. In the end, still feeling jittery from the gory discovery, and the fact that no one seemed to know what the hell kind of creature had caused such devastation, I yelled out, "So, what's with all this secret-looking stuff not going into the woods? I mean, what do you think is out here? A Bigfoot? A Wendigo? Don't tell me. There's a UFO hotspot, right?" The room had gone silent, with the boss beckoning over me to his desk. I wasn't sure if I was going to get reprimanded, but he unlocked his drawer and pulled out a map and some various case files. Over the next hour or so, he and the others told me about different incidents they'd attended to over the years. Discoveries that they'd made that either hadn't ended up on the official system or had been closed with a fake clarification. The category they were really filed under was unexplained. Looking in the files into the photos, a lot of the bodies were in a similar state to the victim I'd found. Head and limbs torn from the torso, but despite numerous bite marks on the body, fur and feces found nearby, they could not match the animal with anything they'd come across before. Of course, even though I'd grown up reading Goosebumps and watching Supernatural, I didn't actually believe in anything unexplained. That notion was ridiculous. Must be some sort of hybrid predator, like a wolf and a cougar had somehow produced offspring. No, the boss had told me. The DNA blood tested at the scene had no similarities with any other animal, except one, he had told me. He pulled out a sheet of paper from the file, and the printout from the blood found today. It was a match, so the same creature had attacked the latest victim and the person in this older file. Maybe all the files. Then I noticed the anomaly. The one creature it had something in common with. Human. So I asked if a person did this. But it couldn't be. If they really thought it was a person, a human being responsible. Why were they looking into it and not the police? I mean, why not the FBI, if there were this many blatant cases? But he told me it wasn't a person, and the DNA says it was definitely not a human, but maybe at some point it was. I can't even really explain how that made me feel, or what I was thinking. It did go through my mind that maybe this was some sort of elaborate prank or initiation, that someone would shout, "Gotcha!" But it never came. Needless to say, the case was closed very fast. I'm guessing the file ended up locked in a drawer, along with the others. For the next few weeks, we all had to double up when we went out, especially if it was dark or we were headed off the paths. It kept the camp and trails shut to the public too. And I still haven't seen a deer or even a rabbit, although the birds seem to be back. There's something out there for sure, but for now, it remains unexplained. My search and rescue experience is not specific to a park, rangers, or even one emergency service. I have been fortunate enough to be exposed to many different situations all throughout my short career. The following are quick stories about some of those incidents. I've only been a ranger now for 2 years, and before that, I spent another 5 years in the military as an infantryman. All that I know is combat, but working with civilians has taught me valuable lessons on how to take charge. Like how I now wish we had increased the search area on this case a lot sooner and before the weather had changed. It's the weirdest and most frightening experience I've ever had, despite seeing action in the army, because there's never been a rational explanation for what happened to those women. The 3 ladies in question were hiking along a well-traveled trail up to Mount Rainier when they went missing. On the 5th day, it started snowing very hard, and there was no sign of them anywhere. One of their boyfriends had called in, claiming the women were all young, fit and healthy, most importantly. Experienced hikers, even if the weather had taken a most unexpected turn. There was no GPS or cell phone activity from any of them, and hadn't been since the 2nd day. If it had been snowing the entire time, I would have to be more inclined to expect to find 3 frozen bodies, but the snow had only just begun. Albeit that now the snow had added to the problem. It should not have been the cause. I headed up to the last place one of them had used to call, and we located the GPS signal, then followed the trail myself until I reached their intended finish and rendezvous. There was indeed no sign or anything, the snow now covering any tracks I might have been able to spot. I spent that entire day exploring the area as much as the weather would allow me to, checking above me the whole time. You'd be surprised how many clues there are in the trees that regular people might miss. But no, I couldn't find a thing. It was like those 3 women just found a hole in the ground and were sucked in. Snow had continued to fall for the next 4 days solid, and we gave up much hope ever finding them alive. Even if they had managed to crawl into some space that I didn't know existed, they'd have likely have frozen to death by now anyway. On the 4th day, so now 9 days since they were supposed to have finished the trail, the weather now grew warmer, and snow began to melt some. So I headed back out, taking one of the dogs with me this time that I had borrowed for the job. See, Old Shep was a cadaver dog, trained to sniff out corpses. As I said, I wasn't expecting to find any of those ladies alive. I'm sure you already figured out this story won't have a happy ending. First off, Old Shep did find something like what I'd been expecting. A leg. One cleanly amputated left leg. No boot or clothing. Just the leg. A leg that, aside from no longer being clothed or attached to its owner, was perfectly fine. Not bruised, not gashed, no bite marks. Then, we found one of the women, just walking on the trail. I immediately called for an airlift, covering her in warm blankets, giving her fluids. She was still fully dressed in her hiking clothes. No visible cuts, bruises, although you could tell from looking at her. She was in shock, suffering from hypothermia, and appeared to be starving. Her pack and cell were missing, despite me trying to find out if she knew where the others were. She was unable or unwilling to talk. Once at the hospital, they checked over her but couldn't find any physical or long-term injuries or issues. No frostbite, no flesh wounds, nothing. As soon as she was warm and had eaten, she was asked a ton of questions, but nothing. She spent months in the hospital, just recovering. Having been moved onto the psych ward pretty early to my knowledge, was barely able to communicate at all, let alone give an explanation. We never found any more of the second woman, other than that leg, and nothing at all of the third woman, nor their packs or cells or any belongings. It just disappeared. But the scariest part, the part that makes no sense, even less sense than 3 fit and healthy women going out onto a well-used trail and only one coming back, is that this is not the first occurrence of a group of people just disappearing, and only one returning without a scratch or mark on them. But no one has any reasonable explanation as to what could be the cause. To start off with, this was back in 2006, late spring. At the time, I had never heard of a Dogman, even though I lived and grew up all around the state of Michigan, since my parents moved around the state a lot. Anyway, enough background info on me. Here's the story. My parents and I lived in a house at one point, on the outskirts of a relatively smallish town, Lake City. We moved there from another small town called Reed City. Now, this area is very woodsy, so Dogmen were certainly not out of place for me, even before my first Dogman experience. Seeing strange creatures lumbering around near my home was really common to me at the time. We had coyotes that would often visit our yard. We lived right next to a forest. So this night, it was around 10:30 p.m. when my dad pulls back up into the driveway after being out with some friends, maybe drinking or something like that. I can't remember. As soon as we got inside, he mentioned there was some weird dog thing outside approaching the house, but blew it off because he couldn't see that well due to the poor lighting of night. I remember my mom was cursing, as my little brother had been running a high-grade fever, and she'd only just gotten him off to sleep. She was more concerned about potential barking and yapping waking him than anything else. I mean, as far as we know, we had no reason to be scared, right? And I agreed. Sort of. I mean, as I said, I had seen plenty of dogs since we moved here. None had seemed threatening or rabid, or like they wanted to attack. Certainly none had been in the past, at least the boundaries of the property before. Not even the coyotes. Probably since we didn't have nothing they wanted. But Dad was adamant that night that this particular dog-like thing he'd seen was different. For starters, he said it was huge, far bigger than any dog he'd ever seen, even bigger than a wolf. Of course, Mom didn't believe him. She thought that he had just had too much to drink and was simply imagining stuff. She went off to check on my brother in a huff, while my dad, usually a pretty laid-back guy, even after he'd had a few beers, paced back and forth in front of the window in the den which looked directly out onto the porch into the woods. The yard light was on, casting a very eerie shadow. He cried out. All of a sudden, as I joined him by the window with him pointing, I too could see something I'll never forget. A shadow, a silhouette, something way bigger than just a dog. 2 bright yellow piercing eyes staring right in at us. It had come way past the boundary and now appeared to be actually in our yard. Not quite close enough to be fully illuminated by the outdoor lighting, but enough so we can definitely make out its presence. My dad shouted at me to grab the gun, so I ran to the locker, quickly pulling a shotgun and any spare shells. As he was loading it, Mom called down the stairs to ask what was going on. What's all the commotion about? He told her to stay in Randy's room and lock the door. Sensing urgency in the tone of his voice, my mother disappeared. I knew there was a handgun in my dad's bedside drawer, but I had never been that happy or confident with a firearm. So, besides the very basics, making sure the safety was on, I was as certain I would shoot off my own foot. So I grabbed my baseball hat instead, and I'd play all through high school and had a decent swing. I hoped that would be enough to stop whatever the heck this thing is that was actually outside. I heard a door slam upstairs. Dad slowly opened the back screen door, told me to stay where I was for now, even though he was far more efficient with the shotgun. He did not want to risk there being a scuffle and me potentially getting hurt. He wanted to try and scare this thing off, first and foremost. Surely, he would do anything to protect his family and property. But we weren't violent people, as I was to come out to the yard as a last resort if he needed me, and otherwise was to stand guard at the door. Extra security for Mom and my brother. Watching Dad edge out onto the yard, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was this guttural growl, deeper than anything I'd ever heard, like any animal before. It sounded threatening, territorial, and most of all, pissed and ready for a fight. Dad took a shot towards it, not on target, but so it knew he meant business, which should have been enough to send it running with its tail between its legs. But this wasn't no ordinary animal. Upon hearing the shot, it pounced at my father, picked him up and threw him like he was no more than a rag doll. He was thrown at the door and landed in a lump at my feet. As I bent down to make sure Dad was okay and breathing, I got a good look at what the heck was out there. It was huge, around 7 feet tall, standing upright on its hind legs, and very, very solid. Like, even though it was covered in hair, you could literally see the muscles rippling underneath, which explained why it had been able to pick up my dad so easily. Its head and facial features were kind of like that of a Doberman pinscher, and it looked mad. Ears pinned back, teeth bared, snarling. Dad seemed to be breathing, but unconscious. I could see his head was bleeding, but he's a big guy, and I was skinny, built for baseball, not wrestling or football. I tried to drag him to the screen door when the thing suddenly held like a wolf, rushing at the house. I'm ashamed to say that fear and panic took over. I slammed the inner door, running upstairs, locking myself in my parents' room, where I knew the other gun was. I threw myself into the corner of the room and crouched down low on the floor, making sure the safety on the gun was off and fully loaded. I hoped to hell I wouldn't have to use it. I could hear all sorts of banging coming from downstairs. I didn't know what that thing was doing. It sounded like it was throwing furniture around, having a tantrum. I don't know. Was it looking for something? Then, I heard a truly awful sound. A sound I had heard hundreds of times before, but now was completely terrifying. Something large coming up the stairs. It felt like the longest few moments of my life as I crouched there, gun pointed at the door. No clue as to whether I'd even be able to pull the trigger, let alone hit this thing when it inevitably came bursting through the door. I was kind of expecting a "here's Johnny" moment as it started to break the wood. I guess it almost made me laugh, and I know sometimes people do laugh when they're terrified. But I clamped my hand over my mouth. I didn't want to give away where I was. I could hear doorknobs being violently rattled, then wood being ripped apart from the landing outside this door. 3 times. That would have been the bathroom, my room, Randy's. Why didn't I hear him or my mother make a noise? Then came the sound I had been dreading. The knob on the door to my parents' room began to shake, quickly followed by angry growls as it began to punch through the wood. I could see its furry arms pushing through, sharp claws tearing away at the wood like it was nothing. Then I heard another noise that made my stomach drop. A whimper. I'd recognize it anywhere. Randy and it was coming from the half bath adjoining the bedroom just a few feet away. As this thing burst through the door, I heard my mother scream from behind the door and knew that she and my brother were in the bathroom. The thing seemed to know, too, as it ran straight over to the door, ignoring me on the other side of the bed, which gave me enough time to stand up and shoot. I must have let off 4 to 5 rounds. I didn't know what hit and what missed, but all of a sudden, there was a nasty smell of burnt hair, gunpowder, smoke, and crap. And that thing screamed. It sounded like a human, but much lower in pitch. More like a human than a dog like Hal. And I could see it had definitely been hit, at least once. And there was a huge hole in its left shoulder, blood pouring all the way down behind it, dripping. It must have been hurt pretty bad for my guess, as it began fleeing, blood all over. I guess adrenaline took over as I followed this thing, but it was super fast and disappeared quickly. I couldn't see it any further, but it seemed like it had run back from where it came. This is when Dad had managed to awaken and managed to drag himself fully into the kitchen. He had quite a nasty bump on his head, but was very lucky there were no other injuries. Go to the doctor's office. Dad made up some half excuse for the bump on his head. They were both fine, although the doctor said Mom's hormones were real high and she needed rest. We don't know if it was just a major coincidence, but not only have we never seen one of those creatures up close before, and certainly none have ever tried to attack. Could it have somehow sensed Mom? And if so, what did it want to do? Dad made sure the house was reinforced after, and I don't think nothing could ever get in there now. Not even a gorilla. He still sleeps with a fully loaded shotgun at the end of the bed though, just in case. And my brother slept in my room for years with Dad's handgun under my pillow. We never saw another one of these things since we knew they were out there. We could hear the howls and growling at night, see shadows moving through the tree lines. Thankfully, our little sister was born not long after. We moved again, and the new house they still live in. It's also nowhere near any woods. I don't think I'll ever be able to have a dog as a pet. Not even something to protect me, like a German Shepherd or a Doberman Pinscher. Just like my parents, I will never live close to the woods. Oh, and one last thing. After the night in question, my parents agreed to not call the police. Had we told them some large upright dog had attacked and broke in, maybe something else would have been marked down. So they didn't bother, in case you're wondering. Call me crazy, but I never imagined I would have seen an animal like this in my life. I was hiking out in the backwoods of Ohio. I will not disclose further information about location for obvious reasons. This is when I noticed a rustling in the bush. When I looked closer, I saw it move. In my shock, I dropped my phone and nearly jumped over a tree to make myself appear as big as possible. It was a bipedal wolf. This thing was absolutely colossal sized. As soon as it noticed me, it bared its teeth and growled something terrible, like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It's hard to describe how frightening this experience was, really. The animal definitely had evil intentions, or so it appeared. Only after all these years could I even come close to describing what this beast looked like. Even though the creature was covered from head to toe in a dark, mangy kind of fur, with patches of disgusting skin. It had a lot of features that seemed pointed and sharp. Its nose, for example, was sharp and angular, ears that were swept back and looked more like horns than anything else. The fur on its cheeks were swept back as well, giving it the appearance of spikes. Claws so long that it's honestly a wonder they didn't break off during everyday use. They were probably as dense and hard as a knife. The monster that they were attached to didn't look like it had any real use for finesse. It had all the earth tone colorings you would expect from any wildlife dog, but some of the darker aspects of the fur kind of created lines around the eyes and cheeks, like you would see in some species of cats, or so it reminded me. It was both wild and sophisticated, mundane and occult. The eyes had a withering effect on me when I caught sight of them. The only real way I can describe the faint lighting coming from them is the way the light behaves when you place a candle instead of a jack-o'-lantern. The way it pulses and flickers. I saw more than just one light when I looked into these things' eyes. I saw something even worse. Intelligence. And then, in that moment, when I was trying to make myself look like I could hold on my own, I saw amusement. It tilted its head, the way a confused dog might, but there's no confusion anywhere in its eyes. My bladder ultimately releasing, and somehow I knew that it understood that I was completely terrified out of my wits. Like a baboon singled out by a lion, my brain commanded me to do one thing, and one thing only: run. I only looked back once. The monster was still just standing there, and it was either surprised that I even saw a point in running, or it was letting me get a head start. I was running so fast and so hard that when I tripped over a fallen log, I went sailing through the air, face planting so hard that I saw stars. But the adrenaline caught me from feeling my injuries, and I continued running at a respectable speed with a limp. After a while, my brain started telling me that I was running on a ruined ankle. The fact that it was penetrating my survival mechanisms told me that it would truly not last much longer. I looked behind me for only a second time in the pursuit, and my heart sank when I saw that this thing had no trouble keeping up with me. It was barely even straining. I could hear its footsteps slapping the forest floor. It's like it was moving in for the kill. What followed probably lasted less than 3 seconds, but I felt the whole thing happen in slow motion. My arms pulled up the side of the trunk. A great chunk of it came off in my hands, worn away over the years of presence of termites and other things. My body swung, anchored only by the other arm. In my new position, I could appreciate the fact that the walking wolf creature had sprung for the kill, its mouth wide open like a fiery crocodile, coming straight for my face. If I'd only been a half-second slower, this large, jagged chunk of wood in my other hand would not have found its way down the creature's throat. The monster still slammed into me, knocked me down from the tree, but its tension had been completely stolen by the wood, which was now lodged in the space where my flesh had been to be. It appeared to roll over in a kneeling position, coughing and hacking. The impracticality of its long claws became apparent, as its long nails or have no use to getting the wood to ease out of its throat, and it couldn't do much of anything without injuring itself. It finally shook its head, but the force wasn't enough to free the wood. And the pain, the blinding terror, and the exhaustion, it still entered my mind to help this thing, but only for a split second. The pain in my ankle was like being electrocuted. I got up and fled, as fast as I could. I don't know what I did to sour my luck so bad that day. The only reason I was able to get medical attention was because I had blindly hobbled out onto the road when a patrolling park ranger hit me with his jeep. That's what got me a bad shoulder and a broken collarbone. Hope you enjoy this story. I'm still living with your residuals. Driving back in the evening, my girlfriend, who was sitting in the passenger seat next to me, pointed out that she could see this large upright dog in the distance. I laughed at her, saying dogs don't walk on their hind legs, but as she pointed and got me to look, I saw what she was talking about. I pulled over, stopped the car to take a photograph, but before I managed to get it out of my pocket, the dog was already sprinting up towards us. The fear on my girlfriend's face as she turned around in her seat looking at the beast was something I will never forget. The speed at which the monster had closed the distance between us was almost supernatural. The closer it got, the more I could appreciate just how much I underestimated its size. I'm far away, and I thought I could have easily been a man in a Halloween costume. But this thing was so much taller. I was convinced I was looking at the real deal, and no man in a costume would have thrown itself against the passenger side window with such force that cracks webbed through the glass. My girlfriend's screaming filled the cab. I was trying to get the car started as much as possible to get away from this thing. All too slowly, the car started and lost forward as I hammered the accelerator. I did this just in time to clip the sides of 2 more of these creatures that had been coming towards us head on. They were just a little too slow, jumping out of the way, and either side of the front of the car likely gave 2 of these monsters an old man hip. I fishtailed for a few seconds, but straightened out the car. We were now cruising at a steady speed, apparently fast enough to leave these things behind. I question this, because when the first one had made contact with the vehicle, it was like a bolt of lightning, ninja fast. My girlfriend was in hysterics. I unfortunately was unable to calm her down. I regret to say that I let the moment get to me, and I kind of barked at her a bit. That didn't help anything. I almost considered taking her to the hospital to make sure she wasn't going to have a heart attack. She told me that she didn't want to go anywhere except home, with me. She didn't want to go to her place. She did not want to go to her parents' place. She did not want to go to the hospital. She just wanted to be near me, her safety. I don't think she thought that statement through. I live out in the sticks. Coyotes, bears, and very likely wolf monsters are probably going to be my next door neighbors. Her home was very much in the city, but she didn't live with any roommates or anything. So, naturally it would make sense that she didn't want to be alone. So, I didn't argue. As soon as I could see and think straight, I headed home. I had to close the gate behind myself. I was very self-conscious when I got out of the car and opened the gate for us. I killed the motor and listened for a long time with the windows cracked. I didn't dare move my girlfriend's window. It was so badly damaged. I was afraid it would fall to pieces. Neither of one of us wanted to be the first one to get out of the car. I thought of my dad's rifle that I had in pieces. I promised that I would keep it disassembled unless I absolutely needed it. He wanted to pass it on to me, but he also wanted to make sure that no kids or company of mine would accidentally shoot themselves. At length, we both get out of the car, and I swear that as soon as I shut my door, I heard the strangest, most blood-chilling howl I have ever heard roll to me from somewhere in the distance. It was like faraway thunder, made by something big. You could hear it miles away. My girlfriend began whimpering. I urged her not to scream, for fear we would be heard. Deep down, I knew it was these monsters, probably having razor-sharp instincts. We got inside, and I made her comfortable on the couch, or as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. I hit up Google and started looking at images of werewolves and lycans and other things. The problem was that these things defy the stereotypical picture of a werewolf. If the Egyptian god of death, Anubis, had been stripped of his official clothing, then that is exactly what we would have saw. No wild fur. They were sleek and shiny, tall and short, smooth, like black onyx stone. I got busy putting together my father's rifle. I didn't think I'd actually ever have to put it together, so I experienced much frustration as I struggled to remember exactly what went where. In an instant, my blood ran cold when I heard that same howling from before. I had turned on the TV for my girlfriend, which meant that the howling was louder than the TV itself. That meant that this thing had gotten closer. Something told me that I had a very long night ahead of me. I told my girlfriend that she could have my bed, and that I wasn't going to be falling asleep anytime soon. The thing is, she wasn't going to be sleeping either. She was so shaken up and her eyes were wide open constantly, as if in perpetual shock. Her exhaustion eventually caught up with her, dozing off in front of the television. I was surprised she didn't wake up when, in the middle of the night, I heard the sound of shattering glass. My instincts screamed that these monsters had found the house that they were breaking through. I found, however, that the monsters were actually attacking the car instead of the house. Whatever scent they had locked onto, it led them to our vehicle. They finished shattering my girlfriend's passenger side window, followed by the windshield. 3 towering, sleek bodies poking their faces all throughout the interior. I could still see their eyes glowing. I didn't find whatever they were looking for, so they began tearing it up. Had we really lucked out that much? Or did they really lock onto the scent of the car and not us? I don't know. They saw us, but it's not us that they smelt in this first encounter. Thankfully, they never came back, but my girlfriend and I are still very much traumatized from the whole incident. I had just thrown another log onto the fire, and my friend had gone quiet. We both noticed we were not alone. A hush fell over us as we looked around, wondering what it could be. We noticed a figure in the dark on our right side, and just then, my friend yelled out. We didn't realize it until later that we had even seen something move from behind us to our left too. But for now, we thought that maybe whatever it was might have been coming closer. The fire in front of us flickered a bright orange and yellow all across the trees, while the night sky above us threw down only stars and darkness. We sat there for what seemed like 3 hours, waiting for something to happen, when suddenly, my friend stood up and pointing into the air, shouting, "What is that?" pointing at a tall black shadow between the trees close by. I stood up slowly and tried to imagine what it could possibly be. What innocent and plausible explanation I could think of. This wasn't as terrifying as it seemed. But as the figure came closer, I knew there was nothing innocent about it. There was no logical and obvious reasons for it being there. Looking back, the best way I can describe it would be that it looked like one of those inflatable balloon people. Those giant, long, thin people that stretched out arms and legs. Only, while those seemed to be fun and inviting, this long, outstretched shadow person, or whatever it was, seemed to literally ooze with evil intent. I crab-walked backwards, desperately wanting to get my feet and run, but my body refusing to do so as I asked. I'm not afraid to say I was completely petrified. My buddy was luckier, and once the thing had started moving, so had he, and I heard the roar of an engine, and understood he made it to the truck, knowing that I might end up stranded here with this thing. That alone gave me the boost I needed to get my feet, but for a moment, I was still frozen to the spot, standing, but unable to run. And that was when it moved faster than it should have been possible, and was right in front of me within seconds. All I could think and feel was that I was going to die. I was so cold, and there was this awful stink. I could hardly breathe, and when I had made myself open my eyes, since I had practically screwed them shut tight with fear, I realized the dark mass was see-through, and I could make out the fire behind and through it. I don't know what would have happened then if my buddy hadn't blasted the truck horn, but it snapped me out of whatever trance I was in, and I ran faster than I ever had before, going towards the beams from the headlamps of the truck. We got out of there and didn't even bother to return for our stuff. We had been hiking for days at this point, and after running from that thing, we were exhausted. We came into a small clearing, just sitting there for a while. We could have stared at the tall trees that surrounded us forever if we didn't hear something in the woods growling at us. It was long and low, and animal-like. We were still catching our breath when it started again, louder and closer this time. Whatever made that sound had been watching us for some time. Who knows how much longer it would stay unseen. I threw on my pack quickly, and my friend already having his on ready to go from taking a quick break. When he turned around to see me struggling with mine, he quickly offered to take most of it off me, which I gladly accepted without hesitation. I grabbed the knife out of my pocket and slowly stood at the ready, in case this thing would come back for us. We weren't amateurs or city boys looking for adventure, ending up well out at our death. We had been hiking, camping, hunting, you name it, for years. We were what you would call experienced. Therefore, we knew this wasn't a bear, or a cougar, or some sort of regular mountain animal. This thing was tracking us, using stealth and smarts like a human, except for the speed and agility that it seemed to be using to follow us and remain so far unseen. And that growl. Up until then, we heard only it moving through the trees and the quick, heavy breathing, or more like panting. Hearing that low, guttural growl now made my blood run cold. It was angry. That was the kind of noise my dog made when it felt threatened. God, I wished right then that we would have brought the dogs with us. Right at that moment, stood back to back, me with a knife, and my friend, a large stick he'd found lying on the ground. We were so completely exhausted, we barely had any energy left to put up a fight. The thing made a noise again. This time, however, rather than the low growl, it was more like a howl, telling us it was ready to make a move. And sure enough, the trees and long grass where it was hiding started shaking, and I made a split-second decision to throw the knife in that direction, like I was some sort of circus performer knife thrower. Whatever gods were on our side right then must have believed in us enough. I hit the mark, and we heard a high-pitched scream of what seemed to be pain. Before I had a chance to recover, we ran. We ran faster than ever before, somehow pushing through the exhaustion. I think pure fear giving us the adrenaline we needed for energy, and we made it back to base camp. One of our friends did not believe us, thought we were being dramatic and making stuff up. So we went back and followed the trail. We refused to join him. When he saw him again a few days later, he changed his mind. He'd found my knife on the ground and a large area of dried blood, and some pure white hair. Not fur, but hair. Safe to say, we haven't been back there since. I swear, I saw some sort of dark apparition in the woods. I'll tell you about it. I was walking home from a night out with some friends. My house is roughly a 25-minute walk through deep woods at the end of my street. I was at a point where I had about 10 minutes left, so I figured I would speed up a little bit and see if I can make it home in 15, since I enjoy going on long walks anyway. It was almost midnight, so there really wasn't anybody else outside but me and the occasional night dog walker. When I got about halfway through the woods, which is where this weird feeling began creeping over me, I ended up running most of the way back to my house. Once I made it to the last street before my own, suddenly everything felt eerie quiet, except for crickets chirping randomly here and there. Something was following me, and it was in the woodline. It was almost pitch black. There was very little light coming from the moon, and almost no street lamps, until you got closer to the houses. My cell was almost dead, and had gone into battery saving mode, so although I had the light app on, it was practically useless. You know that feeling you get sometimes, where you are sure you are being followed, and when you finally get the courage to spin around, there is just another random person heading back from the store or listening to music, completely oblivious to any anxiety they might have caused you. I had that feeling now, but tenfold. I couldn't think of any innocent reason to find someone trailing behind me, minding their own business at midnight in the dark. Every single Hollywood horror movie cliche seemed to apply. It suddenly got super cold. It was almost silent when there should have been all sorts of critters about. And the very second I finally willed myself to turn around, my phone died completely. If this had been Halloween Part 75 or however many there are, I would have been a goner for sure. No, I didn't see Michael Myers when I turned, but there was something there. It was hard to see, of course, since there was almost no light, but yet I could clearly make out a solid dark mass. Something far bigger than a person, and also appeared to be floating. I stood there, rooted to this spot, for what seemed like an eternity, but judging by the time on my watch when I finally got home, must have only been a few seconds. I watched in absolute dread as this mass seemed to get bigger. Then something in my brain just yelled, "Run!" And I did. I can't tell you what it was, as I have no idea, but whatever I saw that night, it wasn't right. It should not have been there. It wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't there to make friends with me. I know monsters exist. I saw one myself one day while out helping my father, who was felling a tree. I was watching from a distance, and in one moment of inattention, I saw something appear on the side of a tree opposite of me. It was not a human figure, but its shape suggested it might be humanoid. Anyway, as soon as I noticed this thing, it lunged towards my father. For clarification, this happened around 10 years ago. My dad has always been a big guy, really strong, and I was a skinny kid, around 12 or 13. Although I was used to helping out, my father had told me to take a step back, as he worked on a particular part of the tree. At this point, we were a bit further into the woods than we would usually have been, on account of there having been a storm and a lot of trees that had been damaged. Dad wanted this particular wood to work on, so we'd gone further in to make sure we found just what he was needing. Being in Pennsylvania, there are also a lot of caves and caverns out here in the woods, as well as huge expanses of trees. I know better than to mess around down there. No that I ever thought of anything weird might happen, but I've also seen what a nasty snake or spiderbite can do. I've heard rumors of there being huge drops in the caves, and no way of pulling yourself back out. That was the closest I'd ever been to them for years, And I wonder now, looking back, if the thing I saw maybe lived down there. What made it come out and go after my dad, I have no idea. Maybe that tree meant something. Maybe the sound awoke it. After, when Father was recovered, although we never told no one else, and we never went back down that far. He said he thought maybe the tree was marking a grave or something. This thing was territorial. Anyway, I was just standing there when this thing screeched and appeared to slash at my father, using its arm and what looked like these long claws. So sharp, they cut straight through his shirt, tearing his arm open. He was successful in managing to swing back at it with an axe in his other hand, and whatever this thing was, met with axe. It screeched much louder and ran off. Well, I say ran, but it sort of skittered about, like a giant spider that was pale and humanoid, and on 2 legs. It would be really hard for me to tell you exactly what it looked like. It was tall, but no more taller than my father. Really pale, almost like an albino. Completely hairless, having very long arms and legs. The head was almost featureless. Large black eyes. No nose or really much of a mouth that I could see. Just holes. We ran like hell back to the house, cleaned up my dad's arm. He didn't want to go to the doctor. I mean, what would we tell them happened? It took ages for those gashes to heal, and he had an awful fever for days following. So he just slept for hours. So yeah, I know for sure there are monsters out there. And if something like this exists, just what else is lurking about in the forests? I can't believe it's been nearly 6 years now since it happened. But I know it's time to put pen to paper. 6 years have passed, and the event still fills my soul with a sense of dread and icy fear. The years keep churning by, and my soul continues to long for some kind of meaning or explanation for the incident. It was July of 2015 to be precise, and a glorious day, Newcastle, Colorado. Yes, I'm Irish, or Northern Irish, whichever you prefer. Me and a couple of my friends decided to go to the Mourne Mountains and camp out there for the night. We had such a fun time. That was until the dreaded night. Even as I recall the incident, my chest fills with a kind of pressure that makes me feel like I'm going to suffocate. Is this what it feels like to be smothered? Or is this what it feels like to have a post-traumatic stress? I'm Ryan. My 2 friends are Chris and James. We're all aged in our mid-20s, and so in 2015, we were all like 19 or 20. It was just meant to be a fun trip. We would drink some beers, and maybe even have some swim in the lake. Just get out there in nature. Something that this generation never seems to do. But something happened on this trip. Something that made James lose his hair over the space of a year. Something that made Chris drop out of university and travel to Vietnam to be a monk, and made me a nervous wreck, unable to leave the house. It was bright until like 10:30. The sky was lit up in a gorgeous mixture of yellow and blue, a few stars twinkling overhead. We decided to toast some marshmallows and make s'mores. It seemed to be around 10:30. It got very dark. We laughed and said it felt quite eerie, like the sky had decided to drop off early. Chris complained he was tired, so he went off to the tent, listening to the crunch of his shoes on the dry earth. I leaned back on my folding chair, closing my eyes. About half an hour passed in which I too dozed. James was just sitting there, texting his girlfriend, trying desperately to get reception. I wake up around 11:30, and James was now dozing off too. I heard a ruffling behind us, and I assumed it was a sheep, perhaps a mountain goat. I hissed at James, "Wake up." He did once and looked spooked by the ruffling. It was like the sound of a hoover going off, very quietly, but one that was sucking up the leaves and sending them spiraling into the sky. I lit up my flashlight, going to investigate. It was a rather short walk over to the bushes where I heard the noise. James came too, a little timidly with his light. At once, I dropped my light, and my blood ran cold. Before me was a creature I had never seen in my life, and one I sincerely hope I never see again. It was tall, bony, with a white skeletal body, with a huge long abdomen and a long neck that was about 10 foot tall. Its arms and legs were short, with strange fingers. It looked canine-like, but nothing like I'd ever seen. It was hideous, like some sort of morbid dog mutation. I knew James could see what I was seeing. His mouth was wide open in horror, staring straight ahead at this bizarre dog-like creature. I reached out my mind and put in front of James's chest, as if to stop him from walking further ahead. The creature's head was the same width, with large bulging red eyes, about the size of tennis balls it was like. The ears were perked up, and appeared to have little bits of moisture or slime. We backed-walked, as the creature just walked off into the blackness, almost like it was going the back way around, to get easily to our tents. As we walked back to our tents, we decided to sleep together in one, and woke Chris up. None of us slept a wink that night, but decided to keep the tent open just so we could poke our heads out whenever there was any strange noise we did not recognize. I haven't been back to the mountains since then. This was a horrific, scary experience, one that has made me afraid and terrified of even the trees, bushes, forests, and yes, even camping. Although time has passed, I have hardly if at all spoken of this incident, but rather buried it in my subconscious. I still feel constantly stressed, anxious, unable to leave the house. If anybody knows what the creature is, I would be most grateful for any help. I should mention, its skin was also really strange, like it had mange. I don't know if that helps you, but hopefully it's an added detail that will get me some answers. It's been 12 years now. I was a young guy of 22 then, just fresh out of college, enjoying those really long hot summer days. Now, I'm 34, married, 3 kids. Life has changed and for the better. Although, I put up a happy veneer. My mind just can't escape from the events of what happened on that day. I'll never forget it. June 7th, 2009. To this day, I still wake up in a cold sweat. Even my wife has to reassure me. "It's fine," she whispers. "Nothing's here." She's the only soul I've told this story to. Maybe she thinks I'm crazy. I don't know. Maybe you will too. But I'm gonna share it anyway. I was hiking in the Ozark Mountains with my brothers. The temperature being insane, something like 91. Very little humidity, so we're getting that southwesterly wind that kind of fortunately kept us cool. The saying, "hot as a 4th of July firecracker," rings true for our trip. The Ozarks are glorious, and on this day, the sun was hidden behind the densely packed forest, which covered us with its trees and foliage. One of the main things I recall to this day was just how tired my legs were from climbing up the mountain. I wasn't as seasoned as my brothers. They were all teasing me and calling me names, which I guess I won't share out of politeness. Even though there are all sorts of myths and legends about the Ozark Mountains, we didn't pay any attention to what we would all call in our family fluff. Instead, We had our rifles, as we were interested in perhaps shooting. My rifle was digging into my hip, and as I looked down, it was actually causing a huge abrasion that I was very worried about getting infected if I didn't get some type of ointment. So there we were, trudging along, when I saw a mist in the distance. It was very unusual and peculiar. It kind of freaked me out, to be honest. I had no idea what it was, and when I asked my brothers if I saw it, they laughed, thought I was being a wimp. But it was a mist that was such a whiteness. It looked like a cloud floating along, submerging the trees and adjoining the area into its pole. I didn't know why my brothers decided to turn slightly and walk into this mist, but one of them said it was just what happened in the forest at this time of year. See, for me, I had no real knowledge of nature or science to agree or refute what he was saying, so I just sort of walked with him. My feet were killing me, and so was my back. I desperately really wanted to turn, and I definitely did not want to walk into the icy mist. This was hampering visibility, and actually made me feel like I was walking into a horror movie when I was walking along. One of my brothers let out a yell that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Even writing this makes them stand up. Before us, with the mist, was the strangest, most terrifying creature I've ever seen. It was a man and a dog, but also a dog and a man. A large human shape covered in dark fur, with the head of a German shepherd or wolf, on the forest floor eating the mutilated carcass of a deer. We all stood there transfixed at this bizarre creature in sighting, tracing its disturbing images. I immediately fixed on its large fangs as it was tearing into the flesh with a forceful and brutal ferocity. I wondered what those teeth were capable of, as I became aware of how soft and tender my own flesh was. This was not how I wanted to die, but my heart was now pounding into my chest, and I was certain this thing could hear me. The creature continued to devour the flesh viciously, as if trying to illustrate how powerful its fangs are. My brother cursed. My eyes were frozen on this horrific sight. I traced the edges of my rifle, which, honestly, felt like a toy gun with bubbles in front of the sight of this beast. I took out my gun, raised it up. I could feel my brother's icy breaths on my freezing cheeks as I felt the drips of perspiration beating down my own head, little vein-like icicles running down. In spite of the stifling heat, I held up the trigger, but my hand was shaking so much I couldn't do it. One of my brothers hissed at me to do it. I knew I had to, but my fingers wouldn't budge. It was like I was trying to move lead. Eventually, after a few minutes, this thing retreated into the bushes, taking its kill with it. I blessed myself. Thank God for protecting us. To this day, I never forget the fear that I felt in those moments. Since then, myself and my brothers haven't talked much about that experience. It was just so frightening and scarring. None of us knew what it was or why something so vicious did not try to attack us. But I'm glad to be telling you all this here, and that I could still recall the details. Perhaps somebody will know what it was. If I could paint a picture, it still wouldn't do it justice to the terrifying form that was crouched there before us. The only thing that came similar was I was reading a book, and I saw a dragon-like creature covered in fur. For a split second, I froze, unable to keep reading. My 3-year-old son asked, "What's wrong?" Of course I couldn't tell him. I wouldn't burden my son with such a horrific story. I have yet to even tell my wife. She'd probably think I was crazy. But I'm telling you all this because maybe now it's time to revisit this memory and forcefully make sense of it. Finally, I can move on, and I might even let my brothers know any findings or developments you help me find. even though we don't talk about it. Sometimes we make eye contact, and I know in that our unspoken gaze, we are both recalling the same terrifying memory. A day that was meant to be special, bonding time with my brothers in the beautiful mountains, had turned into something else entirely. An encounter with something strange, savage, otherworldly, like some genetic lab experiment gone horribly wrong. Surely, someone has come across this mist and this creature before. I still have dreams about it, waking up in a cold sweat. So, I know it's time to finally write this, get my thoughts and memories. I'm hoping this will make me free to forget what happened, and throw it away out of my memory forever. Thank you so much for everything you do, and I hope you can supply me with at least some answers.